Most of all, welcome to this lecture. Eureka! I have found it, Archimedes. Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Julius Caesar. To be or not to be, that's a question. Shakespeare. God is toad, God is dead, Nietzsche. I have a dream, Martin Luther King. All famous words out of the history of mankind. And yes, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, should be right up there. But what exactly do those words mean? And why is Descartes such an important philosopher? Is he the pivot between medieval thinking and modern philosophy? And what is his relation to the Netherlands? All this and more we're going to hear from Dr. Thomas Adriaenssen, Associate Professor Medieval Philosophy and Early Modern Philosophy of the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure after 2 years, I think, during which we've tried to plan this occasion, had to postpone. It's my pleasure to tell you something about Rene Descartes, famous philosopher, scientist from the 17th century. To say something about his I think, therefore I am, the philosophical relevance of that statement, but also the scientific relevance of that statement. And I'm going to do so by introducing you to what arguably is his most important work. Now my PowerPoint doesn't seem to be working, so perhaps someone could step in there. His most important work being the Meditations of 1641. I can just go on if needs be. So just trust me, even if there are no slides appearing. I'm going to say something about his most important work, the Meditations of 1641, which is a work in which Descartes tries to, as he puts it himself, start with a clean sheet. He wants to get rid of all the superstitious beliefs, as he calls them, that he's been acquiring in his early years, and he wants to replace them for something solid. Indeed, in the very opening lines of this work, Descartes tells us that once in our lives, we need to get rid of all the rubbish that we have been accumulating over the years and start anew in order to establish something solid in the sciences, he says. And his method in doing so is to doubt everything, to try and cast doubt over everything you can imagine, and then see whether something remains that's absolutely indubitable. And if indeed something remains that's indubitable, then that should be the starting point for our sciences. That should be the starting point for the natural sciences. Okay. His first step in this process is to point out that most of our beliefs originate from sensory experience. Most of the things we believe because we've seen them. We believe that there is a certain number of people in this room because we see so. We believe that a piece of wax, for instance, is yellow and soft because that's how we experience it. So most of our beliefs are based upon sensory experience, yet sensory experience, Descartes then goes on to point out, is notoriously unreliable. And there he gives a number of fairly standard examples. So, for instance, when a straight stick, is bent, is immersed into water halfway, the straight stick will appear to be bent. A tower, when looked at from far away, will not seem to have the round shape that it really has. And so on and so forth for other sensory illusions. And that tells us something important, Descartes says. Indeed, in real life, we would not... Oh, that's wonderful, thank you so much. In real life, we would not trust a friend who deceived us only once. Well, here again are the senses deceiving us, and a friend doing this to us, making these perfectly straight lines look crooked to us, we wouldn't believe. So what the senses do, according to Descartes, is produce images of reality that don't quite match with the way the world really is. And that makes them unreliable, like a cheating friend. And this then is his first step. He says, whatever I have up till now accepted as most true, I've acquired either from the senses or through the senses, but from time to time, I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Of course, you might here raise a question about this last line. Is this really fair, or is this already setting the bar too high? But let's go along with Descartes for a moment and indeed say, well, in light of sensory illusions like the straight stick that appears to be bent, we shouldn't trust the senses. Even if we take this first step, Descartes says, it might seem that there are still certain things that we can trust, we can believe. So perhaps it is true that the people sitting in the back of this room, to me, look smaller than they really are. That's probably true. Still, even though they may not entirely look to me the way they are, it's still true that they are there, and it's also still true that I'm here. So even in light of straight sticks that appear to be bent, people in the back of the room that appear to be smaller than they are, you might say, well, it's still true that I'm here in the presence of this audience and that there is this stick emerged in the water. And then Descartes goes on to take his next step and say, well, even that actually can be doubted. After all, it does happen occasionally that we dream so vividly that it seems to us that we are in a room like this, or that it seems to us that we immerse a stick into water. Indeed, it's occasionally not possible to tell the difference between a really vivid dream and reality. So that's his next step. Yes, so if you look at this passage, halfway point, as if I did not remember. So it might seem that we can still be sure that we are in the room, that there is a stick in the water, but well, actually not, because that's as if I did not remember other occasions when I've been tricked by exactly similar thoughts while asleep. As I think about this more carefully, I see plainly that there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. The result is that I begin to feel dazed, and this very feeling only reinforces the notion that I may be asleep. So Descartes, again, is setting the bar really high. He's saying, well, in order to believe something on the basis of certain evidence, I also need to know that the evidence is reliable. So it's not enough that the evidence is good as a matter of fact. I also need to know that it's good. So in order for me to rationally form the belief that there are 200 people here, it's not enough that my senses are in fact working adequately. It's also required that I know that I be able to prove that my senses are now working adequately. So that's again setting the bar really high. Just having good evidence is not enough. I also need to know that the evidence is good. I also need to know that I'm not dreaming right now. So this is the second step he takes. Then he goes on to take a third step and say, well, okay, so I can doubt whether I'm in this room. Hence, I can doubt whether you are here, whether I'm here. Still, in dreams, what we do is we kind of make use of stuff that we have encountered. So the things or the people that appear in my dreams are people I've met, are things I've seen. So the people who appear in my dreams might be my neighbors, might be pieces of furniture from my home, familiar items. And even if they are unfamiliar people, then those unfamiliar people appearing to me in dreams, they do consist of familiar items, such as heads, arms, and legs. So it does seem that at least the components of those dreams at least the components of those dreams, match with reality. In a dream, the way those components are combined into a story might be very different from the way the world really is. But those components, arms, legs, people, they, we might think, are still connected to the way the world really is, even though they get mixed up in weird ways in dreams. So it might seem that not all is lost at this point, but now Descartes introduces his third step, and he goes on to say, well, actually, it might even be the case that the most basic items that appear in my dreams are totally disconnected from reality. Why? Because it might be the case that there is a god, or if we believe in a benign god, it might be the case that there is a kind of evil demon that deceives me and that completely makes up everything that appears in my dreams. So an omnipotent god surely would have the power to deceive me. And if we don't like the idea of an evil god, we can just substitute the name of God for an evil demon and come up with this thought experiment. I will therefore suppose not God, who is supremely good, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. So at this point, when we've had the first step, central illusions, the second step, the dream argument, and the third step, the evil demon / deceiving God argument, at this point it seems that there's no longer anything that's certain. So now Descartes has done what he set out to do in the first lines, right? He set out to destroy everything in order to start anew. So if we're going to start anew, then this is where it needs to happen, because at this point all is gone, all seems to be lost. So at this point he needs to find something that's kind of, free from doubt. And in fact, he does think he's able to identify such a thing, because he says, well, even if I'm mistaken about everything, and even if I'm the victim of the deception of an omnipotent God, even if I'm being deceived by an evil demon, then still I am there. So if I am there to be mistaken, well, that means I am there. If I can think and ask myself, is this real or is this just an illusion? Then there is an I who is asking that question. So from the fact that I doubt or think about whether or not I'm correct, it follows that I exist. So that's at least one certainty that we do have. If I convinced myself of something, whether rightly or wrongly, but if I convinced myself of something, then I certainly existed. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, I too undoubtedly exist if he is deceiving me. Let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing as long as I think that I'm something. So, after considering everything thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. So this is the Descartes that we probably all know best. So he's going through this period, this phase of doubt, and then comes up with an absolutely unshakable truth. If I think, I exist. And from that certainty, he then tries to build up to acquire more certainty. The funny thing, though, is that if this were all we knew about Descartes, if this were all that we knew of his writing, we probably would not, or perhaps would not, remember him as a very special or very innovative philosopher, because even though this is the bit that we all know, radical doubt, I think, therefore I am, this per se is not the original bit in Descartes. In fact, some of his contemporaries also noted on this, saying, well, this is fairly standard, so why are you making such fuss about this? I will briefly illustrate that. So I've been myself working a little bit on this kind of argument, not in the 17th century when Descartes is writing, but in medieval philosophy. And in medieval philosophy, we can find very similar arguments in people we have never heard of at all. So I'm now going to give you a name that I'm absolutely sure, Cartesian certainty, that you've never heard of. That's John Tittleshill. And we know nothing about John Tittleshill. We know that probably his name was John Tittleshill. That's about it. And that probably he lived in the vicinity of Oxford in kind of the 14th century. So this is the only text we have of John Tittleshill. I'm giving you some time to read what it says. That's actually a skill in its own right. So if you zoom in on the very first line, you see this first word. It's intellectus, intellect. And this other thing is creatus, created. So it takes some time to go through all of this, but suppose we've gone through this, then what it says in these first lines is the created intellect, so that's our minds really, the created intellect can, on the basis of sense perception, acquire no more than just the certainty of faith that something exists. But of no thing outside of the intellect can it have more than just a certainty of faith, what kind of thing it is that it sees in front of itself. So what Tittleshill is saying here is, well, I can believe that there are things outside of me. I can believe that you are really as tall as you seem to be to me, but I can't really know it. I can have faith, but I can't really know it. Because it's very well possible that the mind constructs an image of you, of the environment, that doesn't match with the way the world really is. He goes on, when an image appears to our intellects, and when we see that image as if it were a thing in reality, the intellect will be unable to determine whether there is something corresponding to that image in reality. That's kind of the dream scenario we've encountered in Descartes. I might think that I'm here and that you're here, but that might just be the movie that my mind is producing for me, so to speak. After all, in dreams, the intellect believes and judges firmly that it sees something, of which it in fact sees but an image. And when it uses that image as an object of knowledge, the intellect is unaware of its own error. And again, God can make any object appear to us by showing an image of it to our intellects. So it appears that for John Tittleshill too, it's fairly easy to come up with those arguments showing that there is very little certainty. Except, of course, the certainty that I exist. Because against all of this, I say that the intellect is more certain of its own existence than of the things that exist outside of it. And in this way, it is possible to have at least some certainty. And here he's following in the footsteps of the 4th century philosopher Augustine, who said, si fallor sum, if I err, I am. So at this point, one might very reasonably wonder, well, what's so special about Descartes? If all these arguments had been around since, 400, that is 1200 years before Descartes was writing. What's so special about Descartes? For that, I think we need to go back to the opening lines and to the statement that the very point of all this, the very point of making all these arguments is to try and come up with something stable in the sciences. And that's really where Descartes is doing something remarkable, where he's doing something special. Of course, at this point you might ask, how is all this doubt going to help the sciences? This, at first sight, seems to be a purely philosophical project about certainty, about whether or not we can overcome doubt. So what's the relevance of all this to physics, chemistry, and biology, which were really the emerging disciplines of Descartes' times? So what's the relevance of all this to the work of Robert Boyle, or later Newton, if anything? Again, Descartes provides a hint. And the hint he provides in a synopsis to the meditations. In the first meditation, which is the chapter in which he gives all these doubt arguments, he says, reasons are provided which give us possible grounds for doubt about all things, especially material things, so long as we have no foundations for the sciences other than those which you have had up till now. And here it comes, although the usefulness of such extensive doubt is not apparent at first sight, its greatest benefit lies in freeing us from all our preconceived opinions and providing the easiest route by which the mind may be led away from the senses. I'm going to give an example, again taken from Descartes himself, of this last point. So the point he's making in this last sentence is that we need to see the world the way in which the mind sees the world, represents the world, not the way in which the senses see the world. Why not? Well, we've just seen that the senses are hardly to be trusted. So we need to represent the way, not the way in which sight, touch, olfaction would, but the way in which the mind would. So what's the difference? Well, take, for instance, a piece of wax. This is Descartes' own very famous example from the Meditations. And suppose I should describe the piece of wax on the basis of what my senses tell me. Then I would say, well, this is a cold bit of matter, and it's yellowish. And it's also kind of soft. So I would give a series of descriptions of the piece of wax based on sensory expressions. It's cold, yellow, and spherical. I see that the image doesn't quite match the statement, but that's, well, let's say that's in line with the topic of skepticism. So this is what I would say. But then again, Descartes goes on to say, none of these statements tell me what the wax really is. After all, if I mold it a little bit, it can easily change shape. If I melt it, it will no longer be cold and perhaps will also lose its color. In the fire, it will appear to me as reddish rather than yellowish. So none of these statements tell me what the wax really is. In fact, when I abstract from what the senses tell me, I see that all I can say about the wax is that it is a portion of matter that is capable of taking on an infinity of shapes. The piece of wax, according to Descartes, is in essence nothing but a three-dimensional substance that can take on an infinite number of geometrical figures. And that is, of course, not something the senses could ever tell you. The senses would never acquaint you with even the possibility of an infinite variety of geometrical figures. So this is something that the mind could tell you the moment it abstracts from sensory data, from sensory input. So what we see Descartes doing here is moving away from statements like cold, this is yellow, this is hot, to kind of geometrical descriptions of objects around us. What we see him preparing the way for is a kind of geometricization of the world. And that is indeed his point. His point of casting doubt over the senses is that we shouldn't be describing the world in this first way, but we should only describe the objects around us in terms of their geometrically describable features. And that means that, well, either we should just not say, as scientists, things such as the piece of wax is yellow, or that we should try to reduce statements about color to statements about arrangements of parts, geometrical arrangements of particles and their motions, for instance. Because that's the only thing that we can really be certain about. That's the way the mind sees things and not the way in which the unreliable senses perceive the world. Indeed, words such as cold, yellow, and spherical, according to Descartes, they don't correspond to anything that's really there outside of us. Cold and yellow are just the way in which things appear to us given their corpuscular particulate makeup and the way in which our brains work. But there's no such thing as yellowness independently of the movement of particles and the way in which they affect my eyes. I observed as a result that nothing whatever belongs to the concept of body, except the fact that it is something which is length, breadth, and depth, and is capable of various shapes and motions. Moreover, these shapes and motions are merely modes which no power whatever can cause to exist apart from the body. But colors, smells, tastes, and so on, I observed, are merely certain sensations which exist in my thought, and are as different from bodies as pain is different from the shape and motion of the weapon which produces it. So when someone stabs me, I will feel a sharp pain. But the sharp pain is certainly not a property of the knife that caused the stabbing. Similarly, yellow, well, that's just the way my brain responds to particles moving around and acting upon my retina. But it's not something that, as such, is out there. So we've moved away from this kind of what he calls childish way of describing the world to a geometrical way of describing the world. And that's the point of all these skeptical arguments. Because, of course, describing the world in terms of yellow, cold, and soft, that comes very intuitively. That's what we start to do as children. But we need to go through these skeptical arguments to see that this is not only what we do as children, but that it is in fact childish, and that we should replace this kind of description for a more scientific, which for Descartes in this case means geometrical description. So instead of saying sugar is sweet, we should say things such as, its parts are arranged in such and such a way. And sweet is just a word that we have for the way in which we or our brains respond to the movement of those parts. Instead of the water is hot, we should say its parts move in such and such a way. And the skeptical arguments that we've seen prepare the way for this kind of program, for this redescription of the world, not in terms of sweet and hot and yellow, but in terms of particles with certain geometrical arrangements and certain motions. And there lies the scientific relevance of Descartes' program. Now you might say, well, if that was your point, why didn't you come out and say it in the first place? So why present this as a kind of philosophical exercise when really it's all about the sciences? Well, Descartes, in fact, provides a glimpse of an answer in a letter he writes to a friend, Mersenne. I may tell you, between ourselves, that these 6 meditations, so these 6 chapters of the meditations, contain all the foundations of my physics. But please do not tell people, for that might make it harder for supporters of Aristotle to approve them. I hope that readers will gradually get used to my principles and recognize their truth before they notice that they destroy the principles of Aristotle. So just briefly by way of explanation. So Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, you might say that for the medieval scientist, Aristotle is what Newton is for us. I mean, he's kind of the big hero. And also the one who devised the program in the first place. And Aristotle also, you should know, and Aristotelian philosophers, his followers, are actually very optimistic about the senses. So the basic idea is that nature works in a purposeful way, so our senses are there in order to detect properties that are really there. So when our eyes detect colors, that's because there are actually properties, colors, to be detected by the eyes. So similarly for taste, smell, and so on. So expressions such as this is sweet, this is yellow, this is cold, are actually fine descriptions of the properties that a piece of wax really has for Aristotle. Now clearly, when you undermine this optimism about the senses, you undermine the relevance of this kind of statement. The wax is yellow, sweet, and soft. And once you've undermined the relevance of this kind of statement, you will need an alternative, and here it is. The alternative is redescribing the wax in geometrical terms. So this skepticism that Descartes goes through really is in service of replacing Aristotelian science for something that looks much more like modern science. Indeed, when you look at very early chemists such as Robert Boyle, they rather closely follow Descartes in this regard. And you might say that with these skeptical scenarios, Descartes is paving the way for Robert Boyle and friends. So here is a very nice statement of this hidden program, you might say, of the meditations. This is by historian of philosophy Daniel Garber in what I think is a beautiful paper. Descartes is absolutely clear that the program of the meditations is not an autonomous philosophical project. It's not just philosophy for philosophy's sake, but it's the prelude to a larger scientific program. His remarks to Mersenne, so that's the letter we've just seen, his remarks to Mersenne suggest that the motivation for the meditations cannot be merely the refutation of skepticism, that's part of it, but that is a problem that, it would seem, is of no pressing concern to the practicing scientist. But the meditations is also, as it were, a Trojan horse that Descartes is attempting to send behind the lines of Aristotelian science. So he's paving the way for this redescription of the world in terms of particles in motion and their geometrical arrangements. Of course, that's, you might say, the outline of a scientific program. Moving from there to actually correct descriptions of the way in which things work, well, that's still something else. But this is the starting point. Descartes, of course, makes his own attempts to give scientifically adequate descriptions of natural phenomena in terms of particles in motions. Not all of those descriptions we would now recognize, and not all of those descriptions we would now find convincing. But he, with his skeptical arguments, paved the way for that kind of description. Let me just give you a few examples of Descartes' own attempt to make sense of natural phenomena in terms of particles in motion. So for Descartes, the universe is a plenum, so no vacuum. Everything is filled with small particles of matter, which he calls corpuscles, little bodies. And these corpuscles move around, obeying certain laws of motion. One law of nature is that a corpuscle, a piece of matter, will remain in a state of motion or rest that it is in unless it is impeded by some other object. So there is no natural tendency of heavy objects to fall down. No, the only natural tendency there is to remain in whatever state they are in. So that's one law of motion he gives. Other law of motion is particles, corpuscles, will in principle move in a straight line unless something else that collides with it pushes them in another direction. And when a collision takes place, that's the third law he gives, when a collision takes place, the colliding body loses as much of its motion as it were, passes on to the next. Now, given that the world is a plenum of particles bumping into each other, what we get, according to Descartes, are kind of enormous vortices, whirlpools of matter. And this is his own image of such a vortex. And those vortices, according to him, are what give rise to the phenomenon of gravity. Why do objects fall down? Because, well, they get stuck in the motion of such a vortex. So this is his attempt at giving a mechanical explanation of gravity. Why do lodestones attract other bits of matter? Well, because there is screw-shaped particles flowing out of them that, as it were, enter into the pores of other bodies, and as a result of their screw-shaped features, pull the other bodies to the lodestone. Again, not a description we would now be very enthusiastic about, but what matters is his attempt to give descriptions of natural phenomena in terms of colliding particles. Someone had to come up with that idea and also explain why it's a good idea. And Descartes has given us such an explanation. He said, well, as long as we stick to yellow, cold, and sweetness and so on, we'll be stuck with utterly unreliable sources. This is the way to go. I will round off by saying something about the limits of this program. So, when I just pointed out this vortex theory of gravity to you, you might have felt, well, that needed Newton to improve. And another area where the Cartesian program really faces its limits, as it were, are actually the life sciences. Because for Descartes, living bodies, plants, organisms are really just, well, very very complicated machines. But he wants those very, very complicated machines to be the result of just particles bumping into each other, not being guided by any kind of purpose. So nature doesn't act in view of a purpose. That's Aristotelian teleological thinking, which he doesn't want. So for him, in a way, those very complicated organisms need to be the result of a kind of chance-driven process of collision of particles. And that's kind of amazing that such extremely complicated machines would result from the chance-driven collisions of particles. And not only once, but millions and millions and millions of times in a row, and always according to kind of the same program. Now that is something that even his own followers find very difficult to account for in purely mechanistic terms. Solutions? Well, some invoke God here to account not for gravity, but for life. Yes, we do need a God to explain whence these extremely complicated machines. Again, perhaps not the most compelling of explanations, but I think the relevance for now is that Descartes' skeptical doubt should not be seen as a purely philosophical project in its own right. It's really meant to pave the way for people like Robert Boyle, later for people like Newton, who will in many ways part ways also with Descartes. It's meant to pave the way for natural scientists, basically as we know them today. And of course, in taking those first steps, we will come across some explanations that are more convincing than others. So we will come across fishy explanations of the origin of organisms. We will come across maybe not so compelling explanations of gravity. But it took those skeptical arguments to come up with this geometricization of nature. And that, I think, is where science and philosophy meet in Descartes' work. Thank you for now. I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Thomas. We do have slightly a bit of time for questions out of the audience. Anyone? Yep, you can throw it there, right side. Throw your hand up once again. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. Does this work? Yeah. The question that I had is, does Descartes have in his perspective sort of make an exception for humans in terms of this geometric or mechanical description of the world? Because then he could also state that humans are mere complex machines, or is there an exception? Well, humans are different.
Yeah, so humans are different. So that's part one of the answer. They are not merely machines because they also have a mind, which is immaterial for Descartes. Second, the experience of color is different from the experience of shape, according to Descartes, because or his experience of warmth is a better example. Because an experience of warmth is highly subjective. So if I have a very warm hand and a very cold hand, and I put the two hands into a portion of water, then to my left hand, the water will seem to be colder or warmer than to my right hand, which already shows that, well, experiences of warmth are not very objective. But regardless of how I feel, the object in front of me will still have its geometrical features. So those are more objective than color features, which will look differently to you than to me, warmth, and so on and so forth. So yes, humans are different because we have minds. And yes, geometrical features are different from color experiences, warmth, and so on.
Thank you. One last question. Yeah. Can you?
Thank you. I'm studying philosophy as a little bit of a hobby. I think it's a very interesting subject, but sometimes when you read about like Descartes. They wrote a book, but it's very, very complicated, and it's a bit intimidating to get into. Do you have any good books or other resources that's more suitable for a beginner to get into philosophy as in general and stuff like that?
Wow. A very nice book I would recommend. Simon Blackburn has a book, I think it's just called Think or Thinking, which is a very nice general introduction to philosophy. In a minute or so, some other suggestions will have occurred to me. So if you stick around, I'll have some further suggestions.
So it's a wrap. If you have any more questions, maybe you can step when the doors are opening. Thank you once again, Thomas. Next week we have a lecture, Happy Sex, and I will never look at a lemon again and say it's yellow. Thank you.
Very good.